For 3 years I lived in darkness, clinging to the only promise that kept me breathing. Tisha's voice whispering, "No matter what happens, I will wait for you." When the bandages finally came off, my heart pounded, my vision blurred, adjusting to the light. And then I saw her. She stood under the golden glow of the chandelier, holding a champagne glass, her fingers intertwined with another man's hand. Not just any man. My younger brother. He pulled her close, whispering something in her ear. She laughed, the same laugh that used to belong to me. The same lips that once swore love to me were now smiling for him, and then I saw it, a diamond ring on her finger. Not the one I had given her, a new one. My world tilted. The past 3 years of suffering, the endless nights of isolation, the pain of never knowing if I would see again. None of it compared to this moment. Tisha turned, finally meeting my gaze. Her face paled. The glass in her hand slipped, shattering, against the marble floor. I had spent 3 years trapped in darkness, dreaming of the moment I'd see her again. I never imagined I would wake up to this nightmare. I had always believed in forever. Tisha was my forever. We met in the most ordinary way, but from the very first moment, she became extraordinary to me. I still remember the way she looked at me that day. Her deep brown eyes filled with curiosity, her lips curving into a playful smile. She had that kind of energy that pulled people in, made them want to stay. And I stayed. For years, Tisha and I were inseparable. We weren't just lovers, we were best friends. Late-night talks, spontaneous road trips, stolen kisses under city lights. It felt like a storybook romance. She had dreams of becoming an artist, and I had dreams of building an empire. But through everything, our love was the constant. She used to tell me that I was the only thing in her life that made sense. No matter what happens, Josef, I will always be yours. I never doubted her, and maybe that was my mistake. 3 years ago, I lost my sight. A rare condition, a cruel twist of fate, stole the world from me overnight. One day, I could see Tisha's beautiful face, and the next, everything was swallowed by darkness. I remember the moment the doctors told me the truth. Tisha had been holding my hand so tightly. "It's okay," she had whispered, though I could hear the tremble in her voice. "We'll get through this. I'll be your eyes until yours come back." I believed her. For 3 years, I lived in the shadows. 3 years of surgeries, treatments, painful recoveries, and through it all, Tisha was there. Or so I thought. Her voice became my anchor. Every soft word, every promise, it kept me going. You. Don't have to worry about anything, Josef. Just focus on getting better. I love you. Nothing will ever change that. She said all the right things. She kissed my forehead before every surgery, held me when the pain became unbearable, wiped my tears when frustration took over. But she also started coming home later. Her voice became more distant. The warmth in her touch faded. At first, I blamed myself. I told myself she was just tired, that she was under stress, that she was still the same Tisha who once said she couldn't imagine a world without me. I had no way of knowing that, while I was trapped in darkness, she was building a new world, a world where I didn't exist. And Siam, he was always there. Wasn't he? My younger brother, my blood. He was the charming one, the easygoing one, the one people gravitated toward. He had always lived in my shadow, and I had always protected him. "I'll never be like you, Josef," he once said. "You're the perfect one." But maybe that wasn't enough for him. Maybe he wanted more. The signs had been there. The way Tisha laughed at his jokes a little longer than necessary. The way Siam started lingering around more often. The way they both went silent whenever I entered the room, but I was blind, in every sense of the word, and the irony was, the moment I could finally see again. I wished I hadn't. The moment the bandages came off, I felt my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. The world was a blur of light and shadows at first, colors bleeding into one another like an unfinished painting. But then, slowly, it all sharpened into focus. And the first thing I saw was Tisha. My breath caught. She was standing across the room, looking as breathtaking as I had always imagined she would be. Her dark hair framed her face perfectly, her soft lips slightly parted, as if she was about to say something. I had dreamed of this moment for years, imagined what her expression would be when she finally saw me looking at her again. Would she smile? Would she cry? Would she rush into my arms, whispering, "I missed you, Josef"? But none of that happened, because she wasn't alone. Saim stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist, his hand resting on her lower back in a way that was too familiar, too intimate. I blinked. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing, my heart twisting in my chest like something was being ripped apart inside me. Tisha wasn't pulling away from him. She wasn't pushing his hand off her body. She was standing there, letting it happen. And then I saw the ring. A new one. Not the engagement ring I had given her 3 years ago. A different one. Everything inside me froze. The sterile air of the hospital room felt suffocating. My fingers dug into the sheets, trying to ground myself, trying to convince myself that I wasn't seeing what I thought I was seeing. This was Tisha. My Tisha. The woman who had promised me forever. The woman who had whispered her love into my ear when I had nothing but darkness around me. She had promised to wait. Josef? Her voice was barely above a whisper, shaky, uncertain. I swallowed, my throat dry. Tisha, I rasped, my voice unfamiliar even to myself. What's going on? A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. And then Saim spoke. "You're awake." There was no shock in his voice, no hesitation, just 2 simple words, spoken as if he had been expecting this, expecting me. Tisha stepped forward, hesitant. "Josef, I couldn't listen. I couldn't breathe." Everything crashed down at once. The surgeries, the years of isolation, the pain of losing my vision, the hope that had carried me through it all. It had been her. She had been my reason, my purpose. But now, looking at her in Saim's arms, wearing another man's ring, had I been nothing more than a ghost to her these past 3 years? A burden she was forced to carry? I felt sick. I forced myself to look at Saim, my own brother. "You..." My voice shook with barely contained rage. "You and Tisha?" Saim didn't flinch. He didn't even look guilty. His lips curved slightly, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. "Things change, Josef," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "You've been gone a long time." Gone? I had been blind, not dead. I turned back to Tisha, silently begging her to tell me this was all a mistake, that there was an explanation, that she hadn't just replaced me, but she just stood there, silent. Her eyes were glassy, but there was no fight in them, no denial, no desperate attempt to make me understand. And that was what shattered me the most. Not the betrayal, not the ring, but the fact that she didn't even try to stop me from believing it. A hollow laugh escaped me, bitter and sharp. "So that's it?" My voice was a quiet, deadly thing. 3 years of my life, 3 years of pain. And this is what I wake up to? Tisha flinched. For a split second, something like regret flashed across her face, but she still said nothing. Saim exhaled, his arm tightening around her waist. "Josef, don't make a scene. Let's be adults about this." Adults. He said it so easily, like what he had done wasn't the ultimate betrayal. Like this wasn't my life he had stolen. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. Everything in me was screaming. My mind wanted to shut down, to reject this reality, to go back to the darkness because it had to be better than this. But I didn't. I had already lost 3 years of my life. I wouldn't waste another second on someone who had already let me go. The pain in my chest was unbearable, suffocating, but I refused to let them see it. I refused to let them break me. So I did the only thing I could do. I nodded once. All right. Tisha's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but I didn't wait to hear it. I stood up. Without another word, without another glance at the woman who was supposed to be mine, I turned and walked out. And for the first time in 3 years, I saw clearly. Tisha was no longer my forever. She was just another thing I had survived. The cold air outside the hospital burned against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the fire raging inside my chest. I kept walking. One step, after another, even though my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. I had imagined this day 1,000 times, pictured how it would feel to finally see again, to look into Tisha's eyes and tell her that I made it, that I had survived the darkness. But I never expected this. Tisha. Together. The image of them, standing so close, his hand possessively resting on her waist, played in my mind like a cruel loop, over and over. I had spent 3 years thinking she was waiting for me, longing for me. 3 years believing she still belonged to me, just like I had belonged to her. And yet, when I woke up, she was already someone else's. A sick laugh bubbled in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. I wanted to turn back and demand answers. How? When? Why? Did she love him now? Had she ever really loved me? But I already knew the truth, didn't I? I had felt her slipping, away even before the surgery. The late nights, the hesitation in her voice, the way her kisses no longer felt the same. I had ignored it, convinced myself that it was just stress, just fear of the unknown, just anything except what it really was. She had been letting me go long before today, and I had been too blind to see it. My fingers curled into fists. She didn't even try to explain. Not a single apology. Not a single word to ease the knife she had plunged into my back. And Saim, he had stood there like he had won. Like he had taken something from me and knew there was nothing I could do about it. I couldn't breathe. A part of me wanted to go back, to shake her, to make her look me in the eyes and tell me why. Another part of me wanted to disappear, to erase every memory of her, to burn away the love I had carried for her like it had never existed. But the worst part? Despite everything, I still felt her ghost lingering inside me, her laugh, her touch, the warmth of her body pressed against mine, the way she used to whisper my name when she thought I was asleep. 3 years of blindness hadn't been as painful as this single moment of clarity. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen. Tisha. She was calling me. I hesitated. For one brief second, the weak, broken part of me wanted to answer, wanted to hear her voice, wanted to pretend that none of this was real. But then I remembered the way she looked at Saim. I let the phone ring. Then I turned it off. She had made her choice. Now, it was time for me to make mine. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to stay in a place where I wasn't wanted. If Tisha had replaced me, then I would do the same. I would rebuild myself from the ground up. And the next time she saw me, I wouldn't be the broken man she had left behind. I would be someone she could never touch again. The city lights blurred outside the tinted car window as I sat in the back seat, my fingers gripping the armrest tightly. Cheryl, my childhood friend, drove in silence, glancing at me every few minutes as if she wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. "Say it," I muttered, my voice rough, exhausted. She exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. "You should have picked up her call," I scoffed. "For what? So she can lie to me? So she can tell me it's not what it looks like?" "You don't know the full story, Josef." I turned my head sharply, my jaw tightening. "I know enough." Cheryl sighed but didn't argue. I appreciated that about her. She never sugarcoated things, but she also never pushed me when I wasn't ready. She had been there before Tisha, and now she was here after her. I let my head fall, back against the seat, staring up at the ceiling. The past few hours had been a blur. Rage, heartbreak, disbelief. I had walked out of the hospital determined to erase Tisha from my life. But no matter how much I wanted to, her betrayal sat like a weight in my chest, refusing to let go. Then Cheryl's phone rang. She answered without hesitation, but as soon as she heard the voice on the other end, her expression darkened. My stomach clenched. "Who is it?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled over to the side of the road, gripping her phone tighter. Then she turned to me, her voice careful, measured. "It's Tisha." A sharp breath escaped me. My hands curled into fists, nails digging into my palms. "Hang up," Cheryl hesitated, then placed the phone on speaker instead. "Josef, please." Tisha's voice came through, thick with something I couldn't place. "I know you hate me right now, but you have to listen. It's not what you think." A cold laugh escaped me. "Then tell me what it is, Tisha, because from where I was standing it looked exactly like what I think." A beat of silence. Then, quietly, she whispered, "I had no choice." My chest tightened. "No choice?" Her breath hitched. "Sime, he forced me, Josef." Cheryl and I exchanged a sharp glance. I leaned forward, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. "What the hell are you talking about?" Tisha's breathing was uneven, ragged. "He knew, Josef, about the surgery, about the money. I was drowning in medical bills. I didn't know how to keep up with it all. And Saim, he came to me. He said he'd handle it, that he'd pay for everything, but only if..." My blood turned ice cold. Only if she chose him. Only if she left me behind. Cheryl's grip on the steering wheel tightened so hard I thought she'd snap it in half. My own. Breathing felt shallow, controlled only by the sheer force of my rage. Saim. My own brother. The one I had protected all my life. The one I had trusted. He had used my blindness against me. He had trapped Tisha into a corner, knowing she had no way out. And she had sacrificed herself for me. The betrayal I had felt just hours ago twisted into something new, something darker. I had spent all this time believing she had abandoned me. But the truth was, she had been trying to save me, and now she was trapped in a life she didn't want. Because of him. I clenched my jaw so tightly it hurt. Tisha's voice trembled through the phone. "Josef, I never stopped loving you. I never wanted any of this. I reached for Cheryl's phone and ended the call. She gaped at me. "What the hell?" I exhaled, my muscles shaking with the force of my restraint. "I don't need to hear her cry about it. I need to fix it." Cheryl stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "What do you need me to do?" I stared ahead, my pulse pounding with renewed determination. "I need to destroy Saim." The night air was thick with tension as I stepped into the grand hall where Saim and Tisha's engagement party was being held. Chandeliers sparkled above, casting a golden glow over the crowd of well-dressed guests. Laughter and music filled the space, but to me, it was nothing more than background noise. I wasn't here to celebrate. I was here to end this. Cheryl walked beside me, her expression unreadable, but I could feel the rage simmering beneath the surface. She had always been protective of me, but this wasn't just about loyalty anymore. This was about justice. As we moved deeper into the crowd, my eyes locked onto them. Saim stood at the center of it all, holding a champagne flute, his usual confident smirk plastered across his face. And beside him, wearing an elegant dress that should have made her glow with happiness but instead made her look trapped, was Tisha. Her eyes flickered over the crowd, restless, searching. And then they found me. Her breath hitched, her lips parting slightly. I saw the emotions flicker through her expression. Shock, relief, fear. She hadn't expected me to come. I kept walking, slow, deliberate. The guests parted for me as if they could feel the storm brewing in the air, as if they knew something was about to happen. Saim turned just as I reached them, and for the first time I saw his smirk falter. Josef, he greeted smoothly, masking his surprise. Didn't expect you to show up. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Didn't expect to be invited? Tisha's fingers curled around the fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. Josef. Saim placed a hand on her waist, cutting her off. The possessive gesture sent another wave of fury crashing through me. I tilted my head, keeping my voice calm. You should let her speak. Saim chuckled, feigning amusement. Why? So you can feed her more lies? It's over, Josef. You need to accept that. I took a step closer, my eyes burning into his. You mean like the way you accepted that you were never good enough to beat me? So you stole what you couldn't earn? His smirk twitched. For the first time I saw something crack beneath his arrogance, the crowd was starting to notice the tension. Conversations slowed, eyes turned toward us. Saim exhaled, adjusting his cufflinks as if trying to maintain control. Josef, this isn't the place. I let out a cold laugh. Oh, but it is. Then I turned to Tisha, meeting her gaze directly. Tell them, Tisha. Tell them why you're really standing next to him. She froze. Her lips trembled, her eyes darting to Saim, who tightened his grip on her. And then I saw it. The silent warning he gave her, the way his fingers pressed just a little, too hard against her waist. She was afraid, my fists clenched. You don't have to be scared of him anymore, I said quietly, just for her. I know the truth now. Her breath caught. Saim's face darkened. That's enough. I ignored him. Tisha, I pressed, softer this time. Tell them. She hesitated for one agonizing moment. Then she swallowed, lifted her chin, and turned to the crowd. Saim blackmailed me. The room went silent. I felt Saim's entire body tense beside me, but I didn't look at him. I kept my focus on her, silently urging her to keep going. Tisha's voice wavered, but she pushed through. He knew about Josef's medical bills. He knew I was struggling to pay them. He offered to cover everything, but only if I left Josef. Whispers rippled through the room. Saim let out a short, humorless laugh. This is ridiculous. Tisha's voice grew stronger. He used Josef's blindness to manipulate me. I didn't have a choice. I watched as the weight of the truth settled over the crowd. People who had been toasting to Saim just moments ago were now looking at him with disgust. Murmurs of disapproval spread like wildfire. Saim's hands curled into fists. You! Ungrateful, I stepped between them. Say it, I dared him. His jaw tightened, rage flickering behind his eyes. You always had everything, he hissed. You were the one everyone admired, the one who was always ahead. For once I wanted something for myself, and I took it. I smirked. And look how well that turned out for you. Saim's nostrils flared. He took a step forward, but before he could do anything, security moved in. Cheryl had already made sure that the moment Tisha spoke the truth, Saim wouldn't have a chance to retaliate. The hotel's security team grabbed his arms, and for the first time, his composure shattered. Get your hands off me! But no one was listening to him anymore. I turned to Tisha. It's over, I murmured. Tears welled up in her eyes, and this time I knew they weren't from guilt or fear. They were from relief. She took a shaky breath, then reached up and yanked the engagement ring off her finger. Without hesitation, she threw it onto the floor. The sharp sound of it hitting the marble echoed through the silence. And just like that, the last piece of Saim's illusion shattered. As security dragged him away, I watched him struggle, his shouts fading into the background. This was his downfall, and I had won. But strangely, as I looked down at Tisha, who was still standing there, shaking, I realized something. Winning didn't feel as satisfying as I thought it would. I had fought for the truth. I had fought to bring Saim down. I had fought to set Tisha free, but after everything, I wasn't sure I wanted her back anymore. The night was quieter now. The chaos had faded, the guests had dispersed, and Saim was gone, dragged away in disgrace. his name already being whispered like a cautionary tale. I stood near the hotel entrance, staring out at the empty street. The weight in my chest should have lifted, but instead, there was a strange hollowness. I had won. I had exposed Saim, freed Tisha, and taken back control of my life. But why didn't it feel like victory? A soft rustling behind me made me turn. Tisha stood there, her dress slightly wrinkled, her expression hesitant. Her eyes searched mine, unsure, nervous. For the first time in years, she looked like the girl I had fallen in love with, the one who had promised me forever. "Josef," she said softly. I didn't respond. She swallowed, stepping closer. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between us. I had imagined hearing them so many times. But now that they were here, they felt empty. She let out a shaky breath. "I didn't know how to tell you. You thought I wouldn't forgive you." I finished for her. Her lips trembled. "I didn't want you to hate me." I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening at my sides. "Tisha, I never hated you." Her face crumpled slightly, like she had been holding in her emotions for too long. "Then can we—" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we go back to how things were?" I stared at her. For a long time, that had been all I wanted. To have her back. To pretend that none of this had happened. That we were still the couple who made promises under the stars, who laughed until our stomachs hurt, who swore we would always find our way back to each other. But we weren't those people anymore. And we never would be again. I took a step closer, watching the flicker of hope in her eyes. She thought I was going to embrace her, to tell her I would take her back. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped on the screen a few times before holding it up to her. It was a flight ticket. One way. Her breath hitched. "You're leaving?" I nodded. "Tomorrow morning." Tisha's hands clenched at her sides. "Where?" "Abroad," I said simply. "To start over." She blinked rapidly, trying to process my words. "You're really leaving me?" A sad smile tugged at my lips. "Tisha, you left me first." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't waver. I had spent too long living in the past, too long believing in a love that had already died. It was time to let go. She reached out as if to grab my hand, but I took a step back. The distance between us felt final now, an invisible line that could never be crossed again. "I hope you find happiness, Tisha," I said, my voice steady. "I really do." She let out a quiet sob, but she didn't chase after me. Maybe she finally understood. This was goodbye. I turned and walked away without looking back. The airport was quiet. When I arrived the next morning, Cheryl stood beside me, her arms crossed. "So, that's it? You're leaving just like that?" I let out a small chuckle. "You make it sound so dramatic." She rolled her eyes. "Because it is dramatic, Josef. You're moving to another country." I sighed, glancing down at my ticket. "I need a fresh start, Cheryl." She watched me for a long moment before sighing. "Well, I'm coming with you." I blinked. "What?" She shrugged. "I've been thinking about it for a while. A change wouldn't be so bad. Besides," she nudged me playfully, "someone has to make sure you don't mope around thinking about her." A real smile broke across my face for the first time in weeks. "You sure?" I asked. She smirked. "Positive." I glanced at my ticket, then at Cheryl, then at the gate where my future awaited. This was it. The past was behind me. Saim was gone. Tisha was nothing more than a memory, and ahead of me, a life that was mine to rebuild, free of betrayal, free of ghosts. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaving everything else behind. This time, I was walking toward a future where I was finally free.